Everyone, we are now in the fourth day of Pesach, and actually fifth day, fifth day of Pesach, and it's also April 10th. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to mention a little bit about the fifth reading of Parashat Shemini, because the cycle of the Torah portions continues even though we're in Pesach. So even though on this Shabbat, this past Shabbat, we didn't read Parashat Shemini, we're only going to read it this Shabbat, meaning in 5 days. But the cycle continues, and so if you have a Chayenu or a Dvar Malchus, whichever one, you'll see that the cycle is still that every day when we read the Torah reading, it's still the Torah reading that is in Parashat Shemini. So basically Parashat Shemini can be 2 weeks. 2 times. There's another thing that is hinted at in Shemini, and something that was discussed. It's one of those interesting trivia things which can be made into something a lot more deeper, but we're not going to do that. Is that Parashat Shemini is the only parsha that can be read 8 times. It means the 8th day, and it can be read 8 times during the year. And how is this possible? I'll leave it for the trivia buffs to figure out how it's possible that we could read it 8 times in the same year. In any case, so now let's look at the fifth reading. We did a little bit of it just before the holiday, and we talked about the fact that Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, had brought incense offering, even though they were not required to. They weren't told by God to. Moses did not tell them, and because of that, they suffered what they suffered, their end. And the aftermath is basically what happens in the 4th and 5th readings. And so the aftermath was that because Aaron and his sons were now in a state of mourning, because the bodies had already been taken out of the sanctuary, out of the tabernacle. So as people who are in mourning, they can't perform all the rituals the same way that they normally could. And one of the things that happened was that there were a number of not burnt offerings, but atonement offerings, chataot, that were brought on that first day of Nisan. And one of these was the chatat, the atonement offering, that is brought every first of every month. And this is a very special offering because, in a sense, the sages say that this offering was not only brought to atone for improper usage of the tabernacle, but it was also brought as a sin offering for God. And that's an interesting concept in and of itself that needs a lot of discussion. The sages say that from the time that God lessened the size of the moon, or rather its brightness, that it doesn't have its own source of light, God says, you need to bring atonement for me for having lessened the moon, for having lessened its light. Now this becomes, in general, a very foundational thought in Judaism. And I want to take a moment to explain it. What is God actually saying? He's saying the moon did something that was wrong. What did it do that was wrong? It said the sun and the moon, meaning the sun and myself, cannot be equal luminaries. In the language of the sages, 2 kings cannot use the same crown. So the sun and the moon cannot be at the same stature. They can't have the same level. They can't have the same type of illumination and bring the same type of light. So that was considered to be a sin. Why is that a sin? Because it seems to be a logical argument, but from the point of view of God, that's like saying that somehow when, let's say, a husband and wife are in the house, one has to be the leader and the other one has to follow, and it's impossible for them to rule jointly. They can't be equals. And that was a very interesting argument, which in many ways is exactly the way the world is today. But we understand it as a state of affairs that is not ideal. That's not the way the world was supposed to be. And so when the moon said this, and it was saying basically, the moon wasn't offering to say, I'll take a second place in the hierarchy. The moon was saying, look, there can't be two people at the same level. It can't be the sun and the moon at the same level. So therefore God said, okay, if that's the way you think about it, then we need to make a hierarchy. Then you be the one who's going to be second. And so he lessened the moon's light so that the moon couldn't illuminate itself. I want you to understand, the whole concept here was that the moon and the sun would both be luminaries equally. Each would have its own source of illumination, of light. Where does the sun get its source of illumination? Whatever the sun's source is, the moon would also have a source. And would be equal sources, and they would be seen equally. So God lessened it. And then God said, every first of the month, you should bring a sin offering for me. Why? Because I regret what I did. It's as if God is saying, I did something wrong. Now, what kind of a statement is that? How can God do something wrong? The understanding is that what did God gain by lessening the moon? On the face of it, when we look at the moon's light, the lessening is not just the source of the illumination, but because the moon's source of illumination is now coming from the sun, the moon goes through phases. And so at the beginning of the month, the first day of the month, there's no moon, you can't see it. Actually, before the first day. The 25 hours before the first day of the month, you can't see the moon at all. Because it's at such an angle from the sun that from the earth we can't see it. The second day, it increases a little, third day, fourth, fifth, until on the 15th day of the month, the moon is whole, it's complete. We see a full moon. So the moon is now at an angle where it's using the sun's light, but it's a complete luminary in and of itself. So God is saying, what did I gain in the end? What did I gain here? On the one hand, the moon dies from the 15th to the end of the month. Every day the light lessens. That's called the lessening of the light. Because it doesn't have its own source of light and it's using the sun's source of light, so as its angle changes, it disappears. But then comes the first day of the month, and again the moon starts living again. So what did I gain in the end? All I did was, I took it through a cycle of becoming smaller and smaller, but then it'll go through the cycle of becoming bigger and bigger until it's full again. So what was gained? The only thing that was gained is that it experiences death. It experiences the waning of its light, the lessening of its light. In the end, it lives again. It's a very interesting thing. I would have thought that the moon would just remain less, but it doesn't. It's reborn every month. The Jewish people are compared to the moon. What does this mean that we're compared to the moon? That even though we are sometimes in a state of lessening, like now when we're in exile, there's always a rebirth. And when there's a rebirth, eventually we come back to being full again. So God says about that also, what did I do this for? In the end, they'll come back and they'll be reborn. So why the whole exercise of the waning? Why the whole exercise of making them less? Let's take it to the individual. Every individual in this world will come back to life at the reincarnation of the dead. So the question becomes, so why does he have to pass away? What's the point of passing away? What's the point of life ending if you're only going to come back up again? So God says about this whole thing called death, I want you to bring a sin offering for me. It's like God saying this is not the real solution. The real solution to things is not that the person needs to die. Instead, what's the other option? What can we do instead? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained this, and again, this is explained in Chassidus many times. He's not the first one to say it. He just made a big deal out of it. And he said that the substitute for death, if a person does not want to experience death in this world, but rather only feel that from one state, he transposes into another state directly, all they need to do is feel what we call lowliness. Lowliness means that I am not worthy. In other words, if the moon would have said, not that two kings cannot be together using the same crown, but rather that one king has to be subservient to the other, and I'm willing to be that king. I'm willing to be the one who's lowly. I'm willing to be the one who's underneath. Then the whole process of death would not have been needed. Instead, what would the moon have done? All the moon would have needed to do was to feel that it's subservient. It receives its light from the sun, let's say. And it wouldn't have to go through the whole process of lessening and increasing again. The same thing is true by us. But it's very interesting. The matzah that we eat on Pesach is exactly what gives us the feeling of lowliness. Why? How is that connected? The sages say that the matzah is poor bread. Why is it poor? Because it doesn't give us a sense of consciousness, but not just consciousness, self-consciousness. When a person eats matzah, there is no taste. It's just flour and water. What makes taste in the world is the leavening, which in Hebrew is called chametz. Chametz means that something is souring. It's becoming sour. It's what's sour that gives the taste. If a person comes and says about himself, this is what we gain during Pesach, that I am willing to be lowly. I don't need to feel separate. I'm willing to be secondary. I'm willing to be the one who's subservient. All this regarding God, of course. And sometimes when other people need me, then I'm willing to be a servant. Then they don't have to go through the process of death. The matzah that we eat during Pesach is actually like the bread that causes us to live forever. Because there's no da'at there, there's no self-consciousness. There's nothing there that causes me to separate myself from others and feel either superior or just as good or be in competition with them and so on. The matzah itself is the bread of the poor. The poor person has an understanding about himself. He doesn't have to actually be poor. He can be very, very wealthy. But he feels, I'm no better than anyone else. That's the main thing. What the moon here said was correct. Maybe two kings cannot use the same crown, but I'm no better than the other one. And so if God tells me that I should be the second in command, I'm perfectly fine with it. I have absolutely no problem. In fact, if God tells me you have an even lower state, that's also fine with me. That's what the bread of poverty, the poor bread, the matzah that we eat, gives us during these 7 days, and in Chutz Haaretz, and outside of Eretz Yisrael, in the 8 days of Pesach. You get to taste from lowliness with food, with actual food. And if we ingrain it within us, then we can actually subvert the need to fall, subvert the need to be lowered down, because we're doing it ourselves, we're already doing it in the proper way, and it's as if there's no need for death, because we're anyway going to come back up again. And so that's the understanding behind the sin offering that they brought on the first day of the month, and which in the end, here Aaron and the sons did not eat it. And we can't get into all the reasons for that right now. But in the end, it was not eaten. And the whole idea is that God is asking us to bring a sin offering in order to make up, to understand ourselves that death is not needed in the world. You don't need to fall down in order to rise back up. You don't have to follow the moon and become lesser in order to go back to your original state. you can actually, through the matzah itself, experience this lowliness and come to the higher level. So I think our time is up.